always like to start with sort of the gist of the message and then go in and kind of explore it in a little bit more detail. I'm going to try to avoid going down rabbit holes, but one reason I'm attracted to history is it's made up by the decisions and actions of people. And I love observing people. And so I don't want to get too bogged down in those stories and go down those rabbit holes, but I do want to kind of give an overarching message. Anglicanism, our particular brand of Christianity, type of Christianity, is born out of the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation. What's being protested, what's being reformed, the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe. Fundamentally, in the most broad of terms, and you're going to find differentiations between the various Protestant denominations. What differentiates a Protestant from a Roman Catholic, and what was at the heart of these reform movements was trying to make the religion more user-friendly in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. So there's a great stress placed on using the vernacular language, using native language, because the language of the church was Latin, and there were a whole lot of people that couldn't understand Latin. Bibles were written in Latin. So the Protestant Reformation was making that word accessible to the people. And so there was a big movement in that direction. Another differentiation between Protestants and Catholics is the fact that Catholics celebrate 7 sacraments. Protestants ground themselves in what's found in the Bible, specifically evidence that's found in the Bible. And in the Bible, Protestants have identified 2 sacraments, and they were the 2 sacraments that Jesus himself experienced. He was baptized in the River Jordan by his cousin John, and on the eve of his crucifixion, he broke bread with his disciples, which of course has given us the Eucharist. And so those are the 2 sacraments that Protestants tend to celebrate, because again, evidence for those sacraments lies in the Bible. And the other differentiating factor has to do with some pretty sophisticated terms, consubstantiation and transubstantiation. And that basically refers to the Eucharist and the body and blood symbolized by bread and by wine. Protestants tend to view the bread and the wine as symbolic. Roman Catholics believe that at a point during the Eucharist, they actually convert to the body and blood of Jesus Christ. As best I understand it, and there's somebody on this Zoom screen whose pay grade is much higher than mine, and he can probably take issue with that, but that's what I wanted to say. For me personally, at the heart of the Protestant Reformation lies the development of a heightened personal relationship with our Creator. And that's debatable. And that's what the Protestant Reformation was all about too, was to access material, draw some personal conclusions, and then question and debate. But that's, to me, what lies at the heart of this movement known as the Protestant Reformation. So the question that teased today's session up for me was, how did we get here from there? And so I wanted to start with here. Good Shepherd Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd, is one of 34 parishes belonging to the Diocese of Lexington. The Diocese of Lexington is one of the dioceses that comprise Province 4, which basically covers the southeastern United States, of the Episcopal Church. And the Episcopal Church counts a little less than 2 million baptized members. It is the 14th largest denomination in the United States. The head of the Episcopal Church is the presiding bishop, who serves a 9-year term. The presiding bishop gains the position at General Convention and is voted on by all bishops and is approved by the House of Deputies. The Episcopal Convention is the governing body of the Episcopal Church, and it meets every 3 years. And it's got a bicameral legislature, which mirrors our national legislature, the Congress of the United States. You have the House of Bishops, which is the upper house, would be the equivalent of the Senate. And you have the House of Deputies, which is the lower house, which would, of course, be the equivalent of the House of Representatives. During that period between the conventions, the body doesn't convene except once every 3 years. You've got interim bodies that kind of oversee the day-to-day running of the church. The Episcopal Church in the United States is part of the worldwide Anglican Communion. And the Anglican Communion is very much a legacy of the British Empire. In 1900, at the height of the British Empire, 1/4 of the world's landmass was controlled by Great Britain, and 1/4 of the world's population were considered subjects of the English crown. And so the Anglican Communion is basically tied to those parts of the world that have a relationship, have a tie to the British Isles at one point and at some point in their history. A fun fact, and something I thought we should incorporate today, is that the first organized worship service in what would become the Commonwealth of Kentucky was an Anglican service. And it was held about 12 miles from here, or 12 miles as the crow flies from Good Shepherd Church, underneath an elm tree at Fort Boonesborough. And there is a book that was written by two members of the Diocese of Lexington, Frances Swinford and Rebecca Smith Lee. Ms. Swinford is still very much alive. She's a lifelong Episcopalian, and she has committed herself to the life of our diocese. But in 1970, Ms. Swinford and Ms. Lee wrote a history of the Diocese of Lexington and the Anglican Church in Kentucky. And I wanted to read these first two paragraphs because I thought because we should. The first public service of worship in Kentucky was conducted by an Anglican clergyman on May 28, 1775 at Boonesborough, beneath the spreading branches of a great elm tree. The stately words of the Book of Common Prayer, traditionally heard within the walls of cathedrals across the Atlantic, did not seem out of place in this green wilderness. No brilliant trappings, no pomp and ceremony here, yet this setting was in its own way just as imposing. The clergyman stood within the shade of the church tree, as it was ever afterwards called, and on this first Sunday after Ascension Day, asked God's blessing on those assembled. He prayed for England's most gracious sovereign Lord, King George, and all the royal family. The voices of the pioneers joining in the responses reverberated through the primeval forest. Some were churchmen from the royal colonies of Virginia and North Carolina. Some were dissenters, and many professed no religion at all. No matter, they welcomed this opportunity for orderly worship. At that point in time, what would become the Commonwealth of Kentucky was Kentucky County, Virginia, part of the royal colony of Virginia. Within a year, there would be a little incident that erupted in 1776 and concluded in 1783, the American Revolution, which of course cut our ties to the English crown. And as a result of cutting our ties to the English crown, we had to cut our ties to the Church of England. And that's when the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States was created. Any questions or anything, any comments? Or okay. What I'd like to transition to now is, if I could, this PowerPoint, because now what we're going to do is we're going to go back in time, way back in time, as a matter of fact. And so let me try to tee this up for us and see if I can't get it. There we go. So we're going to go way, way back in time, as a matter of fact. When Jesus was crucified, as best I can determine, he considered himself a practicing Jew. So Christianity, of course, is the religion that follows the teachings of Jesus. And so therefore, Christianity does not come into being until after Jesus's crucifixion, naturally. And one of the first proponents and supporters of this new religion that's going to follow the teachings of Christ is one of the authors of the gospel, in this case, the Gospel of John. And I wanted to start here, John chapter 18, verse 36. My kingdom is not of this world. And if memory serves me correctly, Jesus made this comment as he's having a conversation with Pilate, who's incredibly frustrated frustrated at this point because Pilate represents the most powerful political entity on planet Earth at the time, the Roman Empire, and he's got somebody in front of him who's clearly innocent of charges. They're framing him, and Pilate is really interested in not really being a participant in this process, but for whatever reason, the person that he's being presented with, Jesus, is not making his job easy. And Jesus, in his comments to Pilate, mentions that his kingdom is not of this world. And that brought to mind Father Hendry's first teachings in this course, that love is all. And this notion that love is all is what we default to as Christians. And that that's not necessarily something that runs rampant with people who are focused in on matters of the world and what's important to the world. And so I wanted to start here with the Gospel of John. I also wanted to start here with the Gospel of John because we're going to be talking about worldly things. We've got people involved in this process, and people are motivated by any number of circumstances. Father Keating calls them our programs for happiness, those things that we do to obtain security and safety and try to help make our fears go away. A dear friend of mine, who's also somebody with whom you are fairly familiar, so I'll try to keep his anonymity, encapsulates this thought very briefly. He says, it's just about sex, power, and money. Those are the motivating forces that tend to drive human beings. And so our story is going to cover those bases. But in the back of our minds, I want us to realize that this religion that we're talking about is about a kingdom that's not of this world. And it's about a kingdom at its heart, of which lies the motto, love is all. And so I don't want to forget that at all. And so that's why I wanted to start here with John. For the first couple of hundred years, we're talking about a religious sect on the fringes, not at all comfortable or welcome in the seats of power. And that begins to change in the early 300s. In 313, Christianity becomes acceptable at the court of the Roman emperors. And by the year 400, Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And at that point in time, things get moving rather quickly. In 1054, Christianity experiences its first significant split or division, and the church divides itself into an Eastern church and a Western church. The Eastern church is based in Constantinople, Istanbul today, and that's the mother church for the Eastern Orthodox religions, Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Serbian Orthodoxy. The Western church bases itself at Rome, and of course will become Roman Catholicism. Once the religion begins to morph itself and become associated with power, things begin to take a worldly and much more secular turn. And that brings to mind a very famous quote by 19th century British statesman, Lord Acton. And I'm using people in quotes to try to, as the vehicle to sort of move us forward through this story. And Lord Acton, there's a picture of him, is a 19th century British statesman, and he famously said, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely." And so now the church is finding itself in the seat of power. And so as a result, some things begin to happen. Power struggles begin to erupt. Father Hendry mentioned last week when we were talking about spiral dynamics, the various phases and periods that civilization has passed through. We pass through them individually, but civilizations and society pass through them as well. So we are in high blue at this point in time. This is the beginning of the creation of nation states. Tribes are beginning to form around the concept of countries. And over the rulers of these nation states, you have the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. And people in power, generally speaking, don't like to share that power, especially when they have it. And so political power struggles begin to erupt all over Western Europe. And the one that I want to just use as an example kicks off just before the year 1300 in France. France and England can't stand each other. They pretty much can't stand each other throughout history. They don't get their act together until 1904, just before World War I. But for the 1,000 years before that, the English and the French are at each other's throats pretty much every day of every year. Anyway, in 1296, things had heated up, and France was ruled by a man named Philip the Fair. Philip was not interested in equality at all. The reason why he was called Philip the Fair was apparently he was good looking. He liked the ladies and the ladies liked him, but that's another story. Right now, Philip is fighting the English, and he's desperate to get his hands on cash because it takes cash to fight a war. And Philip has pretty much taxed everybody he can tax in France. And so Philip calls his advisors together in a huddle, and they look around France and they're trying to spot sources of income. And it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that there's a clear source of income within France that so far hasn't been taxed yet. And that's the Roman Catholic Church in France. And so Philip reasons pretty rationally that, he's defending the Catholic Church in France from the English, so they ought to pony up and pay their fair share of the expenses. And so Philip orders his tax collectors to assess the Roman Catholic Church in France. Pope Boniface gets word of this, and he informs Philip in a pretty hotly worded letter that he can cease and desist. Nobody taxes the church without the Pope's permission. Philip's response is pretty much, screw you, and he continues to tax the church, at which point Pope Boniface decides to up the ante and issues a papal bull. And in that papal bull, Pope Boniface basically tries to draw a red line with Philip and every other king in Europe who might be thinking about taxing the Catholic Church. And Pope Boniface basically informs everybody, I am God's representative on planet Earth, therefore my will is God's will, and no one will tax the Catholic Church. No one will tax my church. At which point, Philip blows a complete gasket and orders 2 agents to Rome to kidnap the Pope and hold him for ransom to teach him who's boss. They actually carry through with the plot, and Philip has his agents successfully kidnapped the Pope, and they're kind of like, what do we do now? Philip's advisors are a little shocked because he's gotten kind of extreme. And so they inform him that this is not the best thing he could do. All of your subjects are Catholic. You just kidnapped the Pope, who's leader of Catholics. And so this is not a real good idea. You might want to consider releasing him. And so Philip relents. He calms down a little bit and he relents and he releases the Pope, who, although he wasn't abused by the agents, the shock of everything that happened to him causes him to die several weeks later. What happens as a result of that, there's a new election for Pope, of course, and for the next 70 years, each Pope that's elected will be French and will rule from the south of France rather than Rome. This is fine if you're France or you're an ally of France, but there are plenty of countries in Europe and territories in Europe that are not allies of the French, but they're Catholic, and they resent bitterly that their Pope is in the back pocket of the French kings. And so you begin to get these power struggles between the church, and the church begins to involve itself in power politics and begins to drift away, if you will, from that message, love is all. Now, during the same time period, you've got people like St. Francis of Assisi doing marvelous things. So we mustn't lose sight of that. But we're beginning to see a papacy that's beginning to be less respected and significantly weakened. And economic, political, and religious and social forces are coming into play that are going to cause long-lasting shifts. Any thoughts or any questions?
Give us the time period again, Woody.
Well, this with Philip and Pope Boniface, this is 1296. This is 1300, and then for the next 100 years, the popes will basically be in the back pocket of the French kings. So at the end of that 100-year period, the popes decide that this is not a real good idea. They're taking a major public relations hit, and so the seat of the Roman Catholic Church moves back to Rome. But what begins to happen is popes become involved in power politics on the Italian peninsula. So we're worried less about love is all and more about politics.
Was it when the seat of the Pope was in France? Was it associated with a particular city?
Yeah, and it's actually it was territory that was owned by the church, and it's at Avignon, which is in southern France, and so the territory itself belonged to the church, but it was completely surrounded by France. So it's basically in the pocket of the French kings. Okay, all right. So now we're also transitioning at the same time from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. And so because we're talking about this transition from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, I need to hit the pause button for a second. 1400, 1450, all sorts of dates are bandied about as to when the Renaissance actually begins. And it's like Father Hendry mentioned last time when he was talking about spiral dynamics, you've got tipping points. It's not like the alarm clocks went off on April the 25th of 1410 and everybody woke up thinking, oh, we're in the Renaissance now. And so now, I'm thinking like a Renaissance person, whereas last night when I went to bed, I was in the Middle Ages. And so I was thinking like a middle-aged person. This is all transitional and it's sort of a moving target. But during this time period, and as we approach the 1400s, we're transitioning between what we would consider the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And of course, there's nobody more symbolic of the Renaissance than Leonardo da Vinci. And you all know about Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, he's an absolute polymath. We've got there his depiction of the Last Supper, which is the basis of the Reredos at Good Shepherd Church. And we've also got, of course, his Mona Lisa. And two quotes by Da Vinci: learning never exhausts the mind, and fortune is powerless to help one who does not exert himself. The Renaissance brings about the concept and celebration of the concept of humanism, which at its center holds the dignity of the individual in highest regard and highest esteem. And it basically becomes incumbent on the individual, on you and me, to become the best people that we can possibly become, to educate ourselves to the extent that we're able to educate ourselves, to become well-rounded in our pursuits. This is where the concept of the Renaissance man comes from, which lies at the heart of the classical American liberal arts education. You want your quarterback to perform in the school play, to write an article for the school newspaper, and then to take all sorts of subjects. And you want the same thing for women. Now, of course, we're talking about the 1400s and the 1450s, so the education for men and women looked different, but the idea that women could and should be educated begins to move onto center stage as well. The subjects tended to be different, but this notion of education to improve oneself and to improve one's mind and to savor the world while we are here becomes part and parcel of human experience. And this is debatable, but I would argue that we're beginning to see, particularly as the ideas of the Protestant Reformation begin to percolate, we're in blue, the spiral dynamic blue that Father Hendry talked about last week, but we're starting to get hits of orange. And in some of the more sophisticated ideas, you might even be bopping up into green. That's not going to be a tipping point, but I would just maybe think about that, what we learned last week. As we're going through what we're talking about today. Ideas become important. The individual becomes important. There is a return to studying the past in the original texts. So learning Greek and applying one's knowledge of Greek to the work of the ancient Greek philosophers, learning Hebrew, and applying that knowledge and translation to the original texts of the Bible, which is going to begin to happen, and people are going to begin to find things that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't necessarily espouse or has minimized, and so you get this learning that's taking place. That's beginning to have people formulate ideas. You also have a sense of trying to make society better. So reform becomes important. And then you get a technological advancement that to this day is considered probably the most significant technological advancement in human history. and that's the movable type printing press devised by Johann Gutenberg in Mainz in the 1470s. And overnight, printing is revolutionized. Before Gutenberg, it was done by hand. And so you can imagine how laborious that was and how expensive it was to produce books and to purchase them. But coinciding with this push towards learning, you now have the creation of material that people can use to learn with. And so these things come together, and you also have a very potent way to disseminate ideas and to get those ideas to spread rapidly. Some people point to the computer, and yes, the computer has revolutionized us. But the printing press did for the Renaissance what the computer has done for us on steroids. And that's why it's considered sort of the preeminent technological innovation, because it caused rapid spread of ideas. And that's going to come into play, obviously, pretty significantly right now. So you've got a weakened papacy. You've got a papacy that's now dabbling in power politics and is more concerned about preservation of its power and increasing its wealth. And you begin to get early calls for reform popping up all over Europe. Three of these folks bear mentioning, and particularly their ideas bear mentioning, because they're going to form the basis for the reform aimed at the Catholic Church and the protest aimed at the Catholic Church. And the first of these early reformers is actually an Englishman named John Wycliffe. And he believed that Christians didn't need church or sacraments to achieve salvation. He believed that salvation was a gift from God, and that there was basically nothing we could do to earn it. Somebody's going to take up that ball here in a few minutes and really run with that one. He believed that the Bible was the ultimate source of religious authority. And so as a result, he thought it was important to translate the Bible into local languages that the people could understand. And so John Wycliffe is the first individual to translate the Bible into the English language. As a result, the church persecuted its followers. The church doesn't take kindly to helpful hints from folks. Thank you very much. We've got this. We're in charge, and you can, just save the helpful suggestions. We've got it covered. John Wycliffe was actually fortunate. He would be considered what we would consider upper middle class. And so because of his wealth and his family's influence, he himself personally wasn't attacked by the church, but his followers, the Lollards, were labeled heretics and branded basically as outcasts. The penalty for heresy was being attached to a post and set on fire. So it was pretty extreme. And so what happens is what follows is sort of a game of whack-a-mole. You get people popping up all over Europe with ideas for change, and you got the church coming around with a mallet, whacking them, and if it's too egregious, attaching them to a post and setting them on fire. A contemporary of John Wycliffe's, a man also named John Huss in Bohemia, wasn't as lucky as his English counterpart. He criticized the church's wealth. He saw the church emphasizing wealth creation and the accumulation of wealth, and he thought that that's not at all, didn't line up at all with the teachings of Christ. That wealth should be used to help those in need. He also believed that religious services should be conducted in native languages. And he opposed the sale of something called indulgences. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. As a result of his troubles, he was burned at the stake. And if you've ever been to Prague, in the main square of Prague, you'll see the Huss monument. And it's a monument. It's located on the site of where John Huss was burned at the stake. Another reformer, Catherine of Siena, she believed that people could experience God through intense prayer. And as a result, she believed that we didn't need priests in order to commune with God. So you begin to get these ideas that are percolating throughout Christendom and throughout Western Europe. As these ideas are happening, the church is engaging in more and more corrupt practices, and many of these practices are on full view of the people, and so the church is beginning to lose respect. Popes are using excommunication as a means to, exercise their power. There's an increasing high rate of priestly illiteracy, which is kind of odd because the church is in a position to educate. Vows of chastity are being broken. Vows of poverty are being broken. The church is engaging in all sorts of money-raising schemes, auctioning off church offices to the highest bidder. The younger sons of aristocratic families had to have something to do with their lives, and so often they turned to the church for a career. And so the church realized it could auction these offices off, and that's simony. The sale of indulgences is beginning to pick up, and Christians were charged to observe and touch and handle relics. Indulgence selling is based on a principle. In the Catholic Church, in Roman Catholicism, when one dies, one goes to a place called purgatory, which apparently is like a waiting room for your appointment with St. Peter when your number finally comes up. And so it was believed that indulgences, the purchase of indulgences, could speed one's deceased relatives' souls through this process a little bit more swiftly. And it's based on the notion that the Pope controlled this treasury of merit. All of the good things that had ever been done by all the saints of the church were deposited into this merit bank account. And because the Pope presided over this merit bank account, you could purchase an indulgence, which the Pope withdrew out of this merit bank account that would help the soul of your deceased relative. And when it first started, it was a very sophisticated procedure. It was very difficult to do. But as the church saw this as an opportunity to raise more money, indulgence sellers, priests would spread themselves across Europe, and they became like used car salesmen. And it got to the point where you could buy on Thursday night an indulgence to forgive you for the sins you were getting ready to commit on Friday and Saturday night. So it became this incredible, I don't know what the word is, but bone of contention in a lot of people's craw. Sort of the epitome of church corruption is Pope Leo X. Pope Leo X was born Giovanni de Medici, and the Medicis, of course, were one of the wealthiest families on planet Earth at that time. And as wealthy families are wont to do, they like to accrue power. And what better way for a wealthy family on the Italian peninsula than to have one of its members become Pope, head of the Roman Catholic Church? And in 1513, Giovanni de Medici became Pope Leo X, and he famously said, "God has given us the papacy, let us now enjoy it." And this is going to put him on a collision course with a German monk across the Alps from Italy, who's just about had it with the corruption that he sees going on in this church that he loves. And of course, that German monk is none other than Martin Luther. Martin Luther was supposed to be a lawyer. His parents were not thrilled when he came home and told them that he had gone through the hell, the mother of all storms, and swore to God that if he were spared, he would give his life to the church. His parents were interested in his being a lawyer, but that was not to be. So he was clearly a pretty sharp individual. And so Martin Luther turns himself over to the service of God and becomes a monk, and ultimately he'll become a professor of theology in Saxony in Germany. And so Martin Luther has had it with the corruption, and he decides that enough is enough. And the basis for Martin Luther's philosophy and ultimately his theology comes from St. Paul's letter to the church at Rome, chapter 1, verse 17, "By faith are you saved." Martin Luther believed that salvation was ours because it's a gift from God. There is absolutely nothing you can do to earn it. It is a gift. And in accepting that gift and expressing your faith, you earn salvation. The Catholic Church at the time taught it was faith and good works, coupled with good works, that earned you salvation. And so this is the fundamental basis of Martin Luther's teaching. He would have been surprised in 1515 if you told him his beliefs, his ideas were going to cause the Protestant Reformation to happen and for a whole new series of Christian denominations to be developed. He just believed that his church had drifted and it needed to repent. It needed to come back to center and come back to basics. And so as a result, he objected to indulgence selling and the indiscriminate nature of indulgence selling. And I'm going to kind of glide over this. Martin Luther is one of my favorite people, and he has only tangentially something to do with Anglicanism, so I'm going to glide over this. But Martin Luther is the first of the Protestant reform movements, and he gets the ball rolling. And here's some quotes. Sorry, is there a question? Okay, so here's some quotes to kind of give you an insight into him and who he was. God writes the gospel, not in the Bible alone, but also on trees and in the flowers and in the stars. I particularly like that because I'm an outdoors guy, and I love the fact that God's outdoors. And then I love this one too. God does not need your good works, but your neighbor sure does. Okay, and that's kind of where he's coming from. And then that last quote. So what happens is Martin Luther objects to indulgence selling and famously writes the 95 Theses, which are just basically debate points. He wants the church to debate the issue and to go back to the basics to see if there's any basis in the Bible for the selling of indulgences. Did Jesus ever mention something like this? And so he just wants to debate the issue. The Pope, of course, takes it as an immediate affront and as a result, orders him silenced. Martin Luther happens to be a very favorite priest, the favorite priest of Frederick, Elector of Saxony, the ruler of the German territory where he lives and works and has his being. He's also the Elector Frederick's favorite professor of theology. So he is Fred's guy. And so Frederick is inclined to protect Luther. And Frederick even shares probably some of Luther's ideas. But Frederick also sees an opportunity, a political and an economic opportunity in protecting his priest and shielding his priest from the wrath of the Pope. And that is political independence from Rome and a possible opportunity to stop having to pay tithes and taxes to Rome and keeping some of that cash at home. And Father Hendry mentioned last week that some folks, particularly in Orange, might support a green impulse, but they do it for different reasons than the person operating from green does, if that makes any sense. And so this is an example of that with Frederick, Elector of Saxony, who's ultimately going to protect Martin Luther. The Pope orders something to be done, and so Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, assembles the Holy Roman Empire at a meeting called the Diet of Worms, which usually makes everybody giggle. Worms is a city in Germany, and Diet is the name for the types of imperial meetings that the Holy Roman Empire had. Basically, Luther appears before the Diet, before the emperor, before all the rulers of all the German states, and presents his case against indulgences. And he is asked to recant. And if he doesn't recant, he will be declared outlaw, which means his life is forfeit. And he says, in front of God and everybody, I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. For the next 4 years, he goes underground and is protected by Frederick, Elector of Saxony. The other German princes also begin to see some good in supporting this new religion espoused by Martin Luther, because it's going to gain them independence from Rome, and it's going to free them up from having to pony up taxes to Rome and be able to keep some of that money at home. So again, we get mixed motives. Martin Luther's motives are spiritual motives. Frederick, Elector of Saxony's are somewhat spiritual. People are complicated beings, but there's also economic and political stuff going on there as well. So we've got all these motives at work. We're going to move now to Anglicanism. We're going to go across the North Sea and the English Channel to the court of Henry VIII, who is the ruler of England, while Martin Luther is beginning the Protestant Reformation by hammering up his 95 Theses on the church door in 1517. So we're in 1517, 1520, 1521. And so Henry VIII is in full control of England. He's been on the throne for well over 10 years. Inspired by Martin Luther, you're starting to get different Protestant reform movements and different ideas popping up all over Europe. You've got John Calvin in Geneva, and he's coming up with Calvinism, which is going to be the forerunner of Presbyterianism. You've got the Anabaptists who believe in adult baptism and believe in separation of church and state. And so they're beginning to foment their ideas. But as I said, we need to kind of take an express train across the English Channel to the court of King Henry VIII of England. In response to Luther and to Luther's work in 1521, he had this to say: a venomous serpent, a pernicious plague, infernal wolf, an infectious soul, a detestable trumpeter of pride, calumnies, and schism. Suffice it to say, Henry was not a fan of Martin Luther. As a result of this, the Pope proclaimed Henry a defender of the faith. To this day, when English monarchs are crowned in Westminster Abbey, as was Elizabeth II in 1952, they are crowned with the title Defender of the Faith. The irony in this is, after Henry VIII, the faith that they are defending is not the Roman Catholic faith, it is the Anglican faith. But thanks to Henry's blowing Martin Luther out of the water, the Pope gives him that title. Henry's going to change his tune. A decade later, he has this to say: well-beloved subjects, we thought that the clergy of our realm had been our subjects wholly, but this is not so. For their oath at consecration to the Pope is contrary to the one they make to us, so that they seem to be his subjects, not ours. Henry's had a change of heart. And what we want to do is now transition to check out Henry's family, because the English Reformation that created Anglicanism and ultimately the Episcopal Church here in the United States is closely bound up in the story of the Tudor family. The Tudor family will rule England for just 3 generations, so it's not a terribly long-lived dynasty. There will be 5 rulers in this dynasty. Of those 5 rulers, 2 of them are incredibly famous: Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. The Tudors get their start, though, with Henry's father and Elizabeth's grandfather, a man named Henry VII. But before Henry was Henry VII, he was a scrappy little Welshman named Henry Tudor. And England was enduring a royal civil war. That royal civil war lasted for 30 years, from 1455 to 1485. That civil war was brutal, it was bloody, and it was full of plot twists and turns. George R.R. Martin based Game of Thrones and that entire saga. He drew inspiration from the English War of the Roses, this royal civil war. The name itself is pretty pleasant. And the reason why this bloody civil war was named the War of the Roses is because the symbol of the 2 warring factions of the royal family were roses. The House of Lancaster on the one side was symbolized by a red rose. The House of York was symbolized by a white rose. Both of those titles, Lancaster and York, are still closely associated with the English royal family or the British royal family today. The English monarch is considered the Duke of Lancaster, and generally speaking, the monarch's 2nd son gets the honorific title Duke of York. Queen Elizabeth II's father was Duke of York prior to becoming king, and Queen Elizabeth's 2nd son, Prince Andrew, is the current Duke of York. So these titles, these sides of the family are still part and present in the English royal family today. In 1485, the House of Lancaster wins. The banner bearer for the House of Lancaster was Henry Tudor, this scrappy little Welshman I was just talking about. Henry's claim to the throne was a little tenuous because his claim goes through his mother's line, and it's always good back in the day if you had it inherited through the male line. But in this case, it worked for him. The head of the York side of the family was King Richard III, who has a pretty bad reputation thanks to a smear job that William Shakespeare did during the reign of Henry Tudor's granddaughter, Elizabeth I. Richard III is sort of depicted despicably. He's got a hunchback. It is claimed that he became king because he murdered his 2 nephews. Indeed, the princes were the sons of Richard's older brother, King Edward IV. King Edward IV dies, and the throne is supposed to pass to his oldest son. But his oldest son and that son's brother are found murdered. They disappear. In the 20th century, skeletal remains were found in the Tower of London, and they were almost certainly tied to these murdered princes. But whatever happened, Richard III finds himself King of England, and he is the head of the House of York. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard is defeated and he's killed. And the throne and the crown of England is given to Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII. Henry's a sharp guy. He is no fool, and there's not much moss growing on him. He's tighter than a tick, and he knew that his country had been through hell, and he wants to do everything he possibly can do to put it back on its economic feet again. And the fact that he's tighter than a tick and a miser helps the royal bank account and the royal treasury. Henry does something else that's pretty astute. He's not really interested in who your daddy was. He wants people working for him who know what they're doing and who have something on the ball. And so he begins to hire based on merit, which at the time, today is really obvious. At the time was something new and revolutionary. But he's a sharp, sharp guy. He also realizes he wants to do everything he possibly can to heal his nation and to get it back on track. And so in one fell swoop, he tries to heal the wounds of war by taking as his wife Elizabeth of York, niece of Richard III, sister of the murdered princes in the Tower, and daughter of Edward IV, second to last York King of England. And so he fuses the two sides of the royal family together. They go on to produce multiple children. We're going to focus on 3 of those children only. We are in the High Renaissance, and they believe in the concept of education. And so they make sure that all of their children, even the girls, and this is something that's particular to the Tudor family especially, boys and girls are given excellent educations and are expected to excel in the classroom as well as on the jousting field and on horseback and all that other good fun stuff, dancing and all that stuff. Okay, so Henry and Elizabeth have children. Henry is getting England back on its feet. England at this time period is a certainly respectable country, but it is not the superpower that it will become. It's actually a mid-range power. And Henry wants to secure England's place in Europe so that he can have a period of peace so that he can build his country's economy. And England at this time consists of England, Wales, and sort of Ireland. To the north of England, Scotland, that's an independent country. And the Scots and the English can't stand each other about as much as the English and the French can't stand each other. And for centuries, you've got problems on the northern border with Scotland. And so Henry VII decides to fix that by negotiating a peace deal by marrying his daughter Margaret to King James IV of Scotland. And the reason why this is important is that Henry VII's granddaughter, Elizabeth I, is not going to marry. And so she has no heirs. And so when she dies, it is the descendants of her Aunt Margaret that are going to come down from Scotland and rule England. Okay, so put that aside. Now what we've got is we've got 2 other children of theirs that we're going to talk about, and they happen to be 2 boys. The oldest son is named Arthur, and the next oldest son is named Henry. And monarchy is good so long as the gene pool holds out. But as we know, gene pools can be nasty things, and they can cough people up who maybe don't have what it takes to be an effective ruler. Elizabeth and Henry Tudor are fortunate because in both boys, they've got everything you could ever possibly want in a Renaissance prince. Both boys have it going on. And so Henry decides he's going to ally England with the superpower of the day. And the superpower of the day is Spain. Spain is ruled by Ferdinand and Isabella, who famously sent Columbus to sail the ocean blue. And so Henry brokers a deal with Ferdinand of Spain to betroth their oldest son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, to the Infanta Catherine of Aragon, Princess of Spain. And so begins this alliance with the Spanish superpower. Catherine comes to England. She's betrothed to Arthur. They get married. They're still a little young. And the problem is Arthur drops dead shortly after their betrothal. Both Henry VII and Ferdinand of Aragon are interested in this alliance being maintained. And so they approach the Pope to get a special dispensation to let Catherine stay in England and marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry who will become Henry VIII. This goes against church law and canon law because a brother is not supposed to marry their brother's widow because it's considered incest, I suppose. But the Pope has the most powerful man on planet Earth knocking at his door, and he's got a pretty respectably powerful man in Henry VII, King of England, knocking on his door. And so the Pope does what the Pope does and decides to give special dispensation. And so Henry VIII is cleared to marry Catherine of Aragon. In 1509, this happens in 1509, and in that same year, Henry VII dies, and his son Henry becomes King Henry VIII of England. Catherine's a little bit older than Henry, but they are a pretty good match intellectually. Henry is no slouch. He's a great student. He's curious. He's intellectually curious. He's also a great athlete. He's all the things a prince, a king should be. And so he and Catherine actually settle down for a period of time in married life, and things go pretty well. They have a daughter, Mary. But it becomes apparent pretty soon that this is about it as far as the birthing babies department is concerned with Catherine. And Henry begins to yearn and chafe a little bit and want that male heir. Because after all, if you have a male heir, then you're set. If you don't have a male heir, you're not set. Henry's eyes are starting to wander, and he begins to light on various ladies of the court as well. And he soon becomes particularly infatuated with one of Catherine's ladies in waiting, Anne Boleyn, a member of the powerful Howard family in England. At the same time, Henry, the lack of a son is gnawing at Henry. And he begins to think maybe this is God's way of telling him he shouldn't have married his brother's widow. And so he begins to come up with the idea that it was wrong for him to have married his brother's widow. And so he decides he's going to seek an annulment. He's going to approach the Pope. It's a different Pope from the one that gave the special dispensation. He's going to approach the Pope and ask for an annulment because it was wrong for him to have married his brother's widow. It goes against church teaching, and that'll clear the way for him to marry this attractive young thing, Anne Boleyn, and then maybe get a breeding program that produces boys underway, because that's primarily the purpose of royals in that regard, is to secure the line of succession. Under normal circumstances, a pope would probably have granted Henry's request because he is, after all, the King of England, and he does have a logical argument. The problem with this is Catherine's nephew is Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man on planet Earth. He controls an empire larger than the Roman Empire ever was because he controls Spain's empire in the Western Hemisphere, along with Spain, the Low Countries, and most of Eastern and Central Europe. And he informs the Pope that he will not be giving a divorce. He will not be divorcing his aunt from Henry VIII, because if the Pope does so, Charles is going to send his army, occupy Rome, and make sure the Pope understands and feels sorry that he was ever born. So he threatens the Pope and says, you're not going to give him his annulment. So the Pope is caught between a rock and a hard place. Okay, he's got the King of England, who's not thrilled with him, and he's got the most powerful man on planet Earth, not thrilled with him. And so he does what anybody would do in those circumstances. He stalls. He just plays the waiting game, and he puts Henry off, and he, breaks appointments, and he does all those things. Henry's losing patience. In 1529, Henry has had it. In 1529, Henry cleans house with his leadership advisor team and puts in more new advisors more favorably disposed to what Henry wants to do. And one of those leaders is the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leading religious position in England before you go to Rome. And in 1533, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, granted Henry his annulment for his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. Overnight, Mary, his daughter, becomes illegitimate because the marriage never happened, and Henry is cleared to marry Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn pretty quickly produces a child, becomes pregnant, produces a child. However, that child is not the long-awaited male heir. It is another girl named Elizabeth. And Henry loved Elizabeth. I mean, it wasn't like he was distraught, because he figured Anne was young and she would get pregnant and have more children. I've got to go into warp speed. My wife is showing me the time, y'all. I'm sorry. I told her to let me know the time. So as you all know, things don't go well for Anne. After she gives birth to Elizabeth, she begins to miscarry, and Henry begins to fall prisoner to the rumors that begin to swirl at court. Anne's family, the Howards, are lording it over basically everybody else, and so there's political backstabbing going on. What you also need to know is that when Henry's marriage was annulled with Catherine in 1533, in 1534, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy, which ended the Pope's relationship with England and declared the English monarch supreme head of the church in England. Also, another move that Henry made in 1536 and 1539 was sheer brilliance from the power politics and economic game standpoint. He appropriates all Roman Catholic Church property in England. He dissolves the monasteries, and the Roman Catholic Church had tremendous assets in England. And so Henry takes those assets, puts them in the name of the crown, and begins to sell church lands to wealthy Englishmen. What this does is makes it less likely for these people to be inclined to let the Roman Catholic Church return, because if the Roman Catholic Church ever returns, they're going to have to give up these lands they recently bought. And so this move by Henry is actually pretty astute. Under Henry, we now get the creation of the Church of England, but the only real difference in the Church of England from what it had been when Roman Catholicism was the official religion of the country is that the king is now in charge. Everything else about the Church of England during the reign of Henry VIII would be recognizable to a practicing Catholic. Okay, so there's not any fundamental change really, except that Henry is now in charge. Anne Boleyn is ultimately charged with treason. Rumors are circulating she's a witch, she has a sixth finger, she has a third breast, she's been sleeping with everybody and their brother, including her brother, which is almost certainly not true. None of these things are true. These are trumped up charges. But Henry is kind of bored with Anne and wants a change of scene and wants a boy. And he's already got wife number 3 in his sights. Anne is put on trial for treason. As you all well know, she is executed at the Tower of London, opening the way for Henry to marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour absolutely is the wife, gives Henry his long-awaited son, Prince Edward. Jane dies shortly after childbirth. As you all know, Henry will go on to marry 3 more times. The only one of those wives I'm going to mention now is his last wife, Catherine Parr. She actually did a service for this family that you can imagine has been disintegrated by all of this behavior. The first daughter's mother was divorced. The second daughter's mother was beheaded. These girls are raised away from their father. Henry's last wife actually manages to bring the family together. And on Henry's death, he recognizes each of his children and basically stipulates that the order of succession to the English throne is going to first go to his son, Edward, and then should Edward die without children, it will move to his oldest daughter, Mary. If Mary should die without children, it will move to his remaining daughter, Elizabeth. And that's exactly what happens. When Henry dies, Edward comes to the throne at the age of 10. Edward will die 6 years later. So England is ruled by a boy king. And so it is Edward's Seymour uncles that rule on his behalf. And his Seymour uncles are Calvinist. And so the Church of England now moves in a much more Protestant direction, okay? Under Henry VIII, it was primarily Catholic. The only thing that changed was the monarch was the head of the church. Under Edward VI, it moves more in the direction of Calvinism. And one of the most significant things that occurs during the reign of Edward VI is that we get the English Book of Common Prayer, written in the English language. There's some additional articles. The 42 articles are created, and these basically spell out the doctrine of the Church of England now. And English clergy are now permitted to marry, just like the clergy of other Protestant denominations. And this all happens under the reign of Edward VI. Edward dies at the age of 16. He's not able to have any children, so the throne passes to his older sister, Mary, daughter of the Spanish Princess Catherine. Mary is Catholic, and she's been biding her time, and she is hell-bent on returning England to the Catholic fold. The 5 years of Mary's reign are going to be bloody and hellish because she is resisted at every turn. She will burn 300 leading Englishmen at the stake, including Archbishop Cranmer, who is the man who annulled the marriage with her mother and who first published the Book of Common Prayer. Mercifully for England, if not for Mary, she succumbs to stomach cancer after 5 years, and her younger sister, Elizabeth I, ascends the throne of England. And she will rule England from 1558 until 1603. And it is under Elizabeth that England will begin its move on an upward trajectory to become ultimately the superpower that it will become. Elizabeth's an incredible human being. She's very intelligent. She availed herself of the educational opportunities that her father gave her. She is pragmatic. She's reasoned. She's intelligent. She's been through hell, and she's concerned about the impact of religious division on national unity. Elizabeth's guiding force is national unity. She's looking for a religious settlement that's going to satisfy the greatest majority of her subjects. Picture a large Gulf umbrella that can shelter as many of her subjects as possible. That's Elizabeth's goal. In 1559, she passes a new act of supremacy in Parliament, which repeals the pro-Catholic laws of her sister's reign and takes authority back and gives it to the English monarch as head of the Church of England. In 1559, she also has Parliament pass the Act of Uniformity, which adopts a modified Book of Common Prayer and decrees that it be used in all of the country's churches. I think Father John is going to take us through checking out the Book of Common Prayer, and it's incredibly important. And it speaks to these Protestant Reformation ideals of using a language that the people can understand so that they can access it and begin to develop their own personal relationship with their Creator. In 1563, the teachings of the Anglican Church are defined in 39 articles, which are generally Protestant, but the Church of England continues to be governed by bishops. And so we're getting this middle way, this via media, that's really reflective of Elizabeth's goal and Elizabeth's personality, looking towards compromise and trying to unify as many of her subjects as she possibly can. The Elizabethan religious settlement emphasizes compromise and ambiguity in wording because she's, again, trying to attempt to unify as many people as she possibly can. When she dies in 1603, which is basically 70 years after Henry passes the Act of Supremacy. So it takes 70 years for the Anglican Reformation to evolve over time in England. In 1603, when Elizabeth dies, England is considered one of the Protestant nations of Europe. And this is Elizabeth, of course. And she famously said, "I have no wish to make windows into men's souls." Elizabeth would have been perfectly fine if you were a practicing Catholic and you wanted to quietly say Mass in the privacy of your home. She was fine. But on Sundays, you needed to appear in your pew in the Church of England, and you needed to pay your taxes to the Church of England. The problem with her ability to kind of give that latitude to Catholics is Catholics all over Europe were gunning for her. And because she was considered to be the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Catholics in Europe didn't recognize her as legitimate. And so they were gunning for her. Most notably, her cousin Mary, who was Queen of Scotland, descendant of Elizabeth's Aunt Margaret. Mary was considered by the Catholics to be the legitimate ruler of England. And so plots swirled around Mary. Eventually, Elizabeth would have to have Mary beheaded. It was the most difficult decision of her reign. But this speaks to her personality. She didn't want to make windows into men's souls. She wanted you to have your own personal relationship with God and to practice the way you wanted to practice. But for appearance's sake, and for unity's sake, and for the sake of the nation, she wanted you to pay allegiance to the Church of England. Elizabeth dies in 1603. Her Scottish cousin, James VI of Scotland, comes to London to rule England. He will be known as James I of England. 4 years after Elizabeth's death, the first permanent English colony is established in North America at Jamestown in what will be called Virginia, named in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. We started our story under an elm tree in Kentucky County, Virginia, and we've brought it full circle, I hope. And I'm sorry, you all, I went way longer than I thought I was going to.
Thank you, Woody. It was quite interesting.
Well, you're kind. Thank you to say that. Sorry. Are there any questions or concerns, or did anything come up? Okay, well, Henry, do I turn it back to you, or do I just say bye?
Well, first, let me say thank you. That was fantastic. What a whirlwind trip. Not many people can take you through more or less 1,000 years of history in a little bit more than an hour. So that was great. Any thoughts, questions, comments from any of you all for Woody? Anything emerge in what he's done with us today that causes a question in your mind?
I had a question. Are there any like specific people that would kind of be considered like the founders of the Episcopal Church in at least North America?
The honest answer right off the top of my head is I don't know. Henry, I would almost pass that one to you.
Yeah. So one of the things we say, Woody, when we're talking about, so you brought us right up to this point, right? So it's an astute question. One of the things we say is that the framers of the Constitution and therefore the country were members of the Church of England. Many of them were. So in our parlance, they're Episcopalians. They were Anglicans or members of the Church of England back then. And as they were drawing up the government and the organization that is the United States, that came to be the United States of America, they're also at the same time in Philly, I think, if I remembered correctly, Woody, developing the Episcopal Church in the United States. So you'd have the usual suspects, Thomas Jefferson and company. They were Church of England folks. There's a, yeah. Oh, I'm about to get the name. Oh, Bishop Seabury. Bishop Seabury was the first bishop in the United States of America. I lost his name for a second. Yeah. So I always think of it like that. Is it Lee? Am I right on that, Lee?
Well, oh,
is that? Yeah.
It's Alex.
Alex. There's a Lee and an Alex. Yeah, sorry. Alex, my bad.
No worries.
Yeah. So I always think of it as really parallel track. And in fact, the organization of the Episcopal Church is very similar to that of the federal government.
Cool.
Yeah.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else out there for Woody or otherwise?
There's a question in chat that says, what did we mean when we referenced the touches of orange versus blue and green?
Yeah.
And we were referencing Father Hendry's class, the class before this one, when he presented the concept of spiral dynamics, which looks at the stages that human civilization has passed through, but it's also a prism through which we pass through individually as we develop through life. And the touches of orange versus blue and green. Blue is a stage, very traditional conservative stage, and it's succeeded by orange, which is then in turn succeeded by green. And those were references to what Father Henry was talking about last time.
Yeah, great.
Oh, and yeah, and there, it's available on. It's been taped, Molly. You can access it.
Yeah. Anything else? Well, great, y'all. So next week, same time, same link, same. Yeah, Father John will be walking us through the prayer book, and he asked me to ask you to bring a prayer book. If you have a prayer book, bring one, and if you don't have a prayer book, you can let us know. You can reach out to Aaron Young. You can reach out to the church office here or Father John directly, and Father John will arrange to get a prayer book delivered to you. You can also access an online prayer book at bcp.org. So it's great to be with y'all. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to Woody. Y'all stay safe. We'll see you out there. Peace.
Thank you.
Thanks.